We're in now the third significant wave in our migration program since the end of the Second World War. Now, the way Australians felt the first wave, which was essentially the post-Second World War Southern European wave, Italians and Greeks. Italians and Greeks tended to do the jobs most Australians wouldn't. I mean, most Australians had somebody else to do the dirty work for them through the first wave. And there was a bit of that as well with the second wave, with the Vietnamese refugees. Now, the Greeks, Italians, Vietnamese were leaving busted countries, so they're prepared to do, and they're unskilled, so they're prepared to do menial work. This third wave, which is possibly the most interesting wave we've ever tried as a country, it's a skilled wave, beginning with China and more recently with India. These recently arrived migrants are going to high-skilled jobs, going to jobs that Australians can't fill at the top end of the income ladder, going to jobs that the mining sector is already filled with blue-collar Australian-born labour, you know, young blokes from New South Wales and Victoria and Queensland heading over to the Pilbara, but running out of other things like accountants and, believe it or not, hairdressers and cab drivers are also running out of those things. It's, you know, in a sense, what you're mapping here is the unfolding story of Australian prosperity and development. First two waves of migration, which is basically physical work, bottom-end jobs, manufacturing work, and big infrastructure projects, which a third wave is essentially your brain economy. And in your brain economy, the competition for jobs is not necessarily one that Australians are ever going to win, because we're never going to have enough people at the top end to be able to match some of the bigger countries in the region, and certainly to match the US. We've been running our immigration program so fast, and we're still a pretty young country. People forget how young we are as a white settled nation. The immigration population now, if you're overseas born or you have at least one parent who's an immigrant, is more than 50% of the entire Australian population now. The British-born component of the immigration intake is shrinking as a proportion of the total. Non-English speaking immigrants and non-European immigrants, now each intake has a majority of non-English speakers from somewhere other than Europe, which is something that we're not used to. Most of them are carrying skills as well, which is a good thing again. But this is a rapidly changing population, and I think for a lot of older Australians and a lot of people who live in the bush maybe, and people who live outside of the metropolitan areas, this thing is becoming unfathomable in another way. You know, there are pockets of Melbourne, certainly pockets of Sydney, even though Sydney's a bit of a drain on the national economy at the moment. There are places in Brisbane, and there's certainly places in Perth, which are growing simply because of immigration, which are quite cosmopolitan in their nature, and in bits of Perth which are looking very English and very South African at the same time. Almost global cities have been developed in our own backyard, whilst the rest of the country still feels like it's stuck in the 80s or the 70s. These things are quite difficult things for politicians to manage, because, okay, you take a trip out to the west of Sydney, and the difficulty in the west of Sydney is getting from A to B. Your issue is not necessarily that a migrant is taking your job, it's that there are too many people on the train and the buses don't run on time, so you're going to blame someone. So you end up blaming your government, and your government says, well, maybe if I slow the immigration intake, I'll be able to empty the buses for you and you'll be able to make your trip to work. Now, that thing doesn't make sense to me in a nation building sense. It might make sense if you want to get from one news poll to the next, but it actually doesn't make sense in the nation building, because we're in a race to grow this country, not to try and manage down its expectations. And the public really can't have it both ways. They want the country to be the richest country on earth. We want to remain the last rich nation standing if that's possible, and we want to be a role model to the rest of the world. So we've got to keep growing. I think it's fair to say both sides of politics misunderstood what works in the Australian model, and they've misunderstood it coming out of the GFC, which is a surprise to me, because the GFC actually validated the Australian model. What works for me for the Australian model is that we tend to be an open economy and an open society to boot, so we believe in markets and multiculturalism. We went into the 2010 election with all this head noise about population pressures and about rundown of infrastructure. And the knee-jerk response from both sides of politics was to cut the immigration intake, i.e. to cut off one part of the Australian model, which is multiculturalism. Now, it didn't work, but what drove this? I suspect what drove this was partly a fear of the electorate, because the fact that this noise was coming back from the electorate coming out of the GFC, I think took both sides of politics a bit by surprise. I mean, I know Julia Gillard and Tony Abbott quite well. They are both multiculturalists. They are not immigration cutters by a personal instinct. But their professional judgment, and I think it was a flawed judgment, their professional judgment was, I've got to pander to this particular vibe in the community at the moment, which is just to put a lid on things. Now the difficulty with that is it inspired nobody, and the public retaliated by hanging the Parliament. So they're asking to slow the immigration intake, but they didn't actually like the fact that they weren't being inspired by their leaders. But let's take it back a step. What works for Australia is not just the deregulation story of the last 20 or 30 years, but also the fact that we've been running a pretty open and a pretty big immigration intake. You can't play games with one part of the formula and still think you're going to get 100% return. I think both sides of politics should be having a good hard look at themselves, because we see in the tensions that have followed the slowing of the immigration program that slowing the immigration program wasn't the solution to the problem. The problem is much deeper than that, and the problem is really about leaders carrying their people with them, about the challenges of the next 10 years, and the challenges of the next 10 years are pretty straightforward for Australia. We have an opportunity for greatness as a society, but we need to reinvest in ourselves. Now by greatness, I define it very simply. We're in the right place at the right time in the Asian region. We are the last rich nation standing in the world. But our next 10 years of growth are going to come from a massive reinvestment, not just in physical infrastructure, but also in the brain economy. That is going to require a short-term sacrifice from the population. A population that hasn't had a recession in more than 20 years. Very difficult message to impart to the wider electorate. But at some point we're going to have to cut the crap, because at the moment we're looking for short-term fixes with what are actually structural problems. The reason why the country feels like it's ready to explode is that it needs a reinvestment. Now, a reinvestment is going to take us back a step or two in our immediate living standards, but it's an investment that will pay off. The alternative, and I'd argue this as an economist and also as a political observer, the alternative is stagnation. Now stagnation we've seen at a micro level in New South Wales. It was Bob Carr who said in 2001 that Sydney was full. Okay, so Sydney's been full. New South Wales has been the slowest state in the country for the last 10 or so years on pretty much every measure. Gross state product, which is the state-based measure of economic growth, population growth, and on the very simple measure of grumpiness. Sydney tops the charts for grumpy cities, so it's bottom of the chart for social cohesion. You want to slow things down, you think that helps things? It doesn't help things at all. You've really got to maintain a continual investment in the place to keep the thing growing. The most interesting wake-up call Australia will get, and it's possible we'll get it in the next 5 years, if the Chinese and Indians choose that America is the better market than Australia. At the moment, Australia has the best of all worlds. It thinks it can slow things down a bit because people are not going to go anywhere else. Like, you wouldn't want to go to Europe as a skilled migrant. You certainly wouldn't want to go to Britain, and you wouldn't really want to be going to the US at the moment. You'd want to come to Australia. And Australia can pick and choose still, but there'll come a point, and I can guarantee you it'll happen in the next 5 years, America's going to reinvent itself, and at that point it's going to be back in the competition for the best and the brightest in the world. And the competition, let's face it, is for Chinese and Indians, because basically they're the two population bases with a skill set that adapt quickest to developed societies like the US and Australia. So we're in a contest in a brain economy sense. We're in a contest for to build the best brain economy in the world with the Americans. The fact that the Americans are on their knees is no guarantee that they won't catch us and won't pass us again in the next 5 or so years. It's going to be very hard to pull it back at that point, though, because you don't get a wake-up call on any given day. Like, the statistician doesn't report a recession and doesn't say, oh, by the way, it's due to the fact that you've started to cut corners. There'll be a recession and people will wonder how to dig themselves out of a recession. And at that point, governments are going to have to start reimagining their dialogue with the electorate. You wouldn't want to get to that point. You want to be able to anticipate the danger and be able to bring people with you on a continual reinvestment program in people, in ideas, in hard infrastructure.